This set of slides is about practical approaches to analysis. And in fact, I'm going to talk you through two different approaches, both of which I think are effective for helping you make sense of data and really straightforward to get started with. First, though, it's worth saying a little bit about what the aim of qualitative analysis actually is, and what it is that we're trying to achieve when we're looking at analysing text or audio or video data. So there's this interesting quote from Sparks and Smith. So they say that qualitative analysis is an artful and scientific interpretive process of meaning making that begins at the outset of the investigation. It involves transcription, data management, immersion in the collected data, a concern with what's in the data or how it's constructed, an examination of any possible interrelationships, and a reflexive awareness of the process of writing and representation. Okay, what that boils down to, I think, is that really, so the aim of qualitative analysis is to use some kind of rigorous process to find patterns and to make sense of data. I promised you two approaches to analysis. So the first of those is what's called thematic analysis. In really broad terms, what you're doing with thematic analysis is working through your data systematically and dividing it up into chunks according to what the data is about. And then taking all of those chunks that you've got and kind of aggregating them into more thematic categories. So to give an example of that, so you might find that a particular participant's answer to one of your questions draws on two different ideas. There are two different things going on in that answer you've got. So you would label those and mark them up in the text, perhaps idea 1, idea 2, and that is the process of coding data. And you've got a single code for each one of those ideas. And you might find later on in the transcripts, perhaps in answer to a different question, that participant draws on the same idea again. So you would mark up again, here's idea 1 occurring in a slightly different place. Similarly, in other transcripts, you might find that same idea cropping up between people as well. So you'd code those other occurrences of it throughout your data. And what that means then is that under that one code, that particular idea, you'd have all the different examples, all the different chunks within your data where that idea has come up. That's coding, that's the coding process. In itself, that's a useful process to go through. That helps you understand what's going on in your data. The next stage beyond that is to say, okay, we've got all these chunks, all these codes. How do they fit together? How can we draw them together into broader categories or themes? And that's really about saying, okay, here's a set of codes that are kind of about the same sort of thing, or maybe a particular group of participants refer to certain codes rather than others. And so you're bringing things together in an attempt to categorize them more broadly and find slightly larger patterns in your data. And of course, that's an interpretive process. So you're going a bit further than what you were doing with coding. So you're not simply summarizing what's in your data, but you're actually trying to combine it in a thematic way. Hence, it's called thematic analysis. The positives of using this approach, the positives of doing thematic analysis, firstly, it's relatively straightforward. So as I've just described, it's not a complicated process, and going through the act of doing that helps you understand and interpret the data, so it's a really good way to get to know your data. It's also a really useful way for highlighting similarities and differences in your data. it becomes quite clear whether people are talking about things in the same way, or whether there are different ways of people talking about the same thing, and so it's really useful for that. I have glossed over slightly how you make that move from codes to themes, and there are different ways of doing that. We'll cover a little more in a later slide, kind of what get called inductive and deductive approaches. But essentially, what that means is in that move from codes to themes, whether you kind of know what your themes are in advance, and that's what gets called a more deductive approach, or whether you approach your data a bit more openly and you kind of generate and create those themes as you go. But we will get to that in a few slides' time. Okay, what are the negatives of doing thematic analysis? Well, one danger is that you can lose a little bit of nuance or some of the more subtle contradictions in your data. And the reason that's a danger is because if you're aggregating together different things people have said under one code, or aggregating those codes together under one theme, then if you're not careful, you can start smoothing over differences in the way people have expressed particular ideas. So that's certainly something to watch out for with this approach. A second possible negative of thematic analysis, and I guess a danger of all analysis actually, is the risk of over-interpreting data. So again, thinking about that move from codes to themes, it's really about ensuring that the themes you decide on as those that represent your data really don't go too far beyond what's in the data, and making sure that you're not imposing a particular way of looking at things that doesn't reflect what the participants are telling you. Third negative point about thematic analysis, and this is really a point about what thematic analysis isn't, and what I mean by that is that, so with thematic analysis, you're not looking in granular detail at the way people say things. So you're not poring over the details of their intonation or the way they pause, the way they might qualify things they say by first saying kind of, sort of. That's really a different sort of analysis. In fact, that's conversation analysis, but that's not what this is. The second approach is called framework analysis, and in fact, in some ways, it's pretty similar to thematic analysis. So certainly in the initial stages, at least, you're still working through your data and coding it, and then working that up into broader categories or themes. With framework analysis, you might only do that with a small initial sample of your data rather than all of it, but then you take that to create a framework that you can fit the rest of your data into. So rather than generating a list or a hierarchy of themes, as you might do with thematic analysis, with framework analysis, what you're looking to create is a table or a spreadsheet, a framework, that does a similar job of capturing what the data is about, what the important themes are. But what you have with a framework is that table where you've got columns, which might be your themes, and then rows as participants or potentially particular kind of groups of participants. And into the individual cells of that framework, then you're summarizing what a particular participant or group of participants said about a particular theme. So positives of framework analysis. First of all, it's a really pragmatic approach to data analysis. It can often require less time than doing thematic analysis. Up front, the amount of work is similar, but once you've got your framework, then actually applying it to new data, actually filling in lots more of those cells becomes quite straightforward. That means it can be very useful for rapid research, especially if you can specify the themes in advance, because that cuts down on the upfront work. Another advantage is that it allows multiple people to work on the framework and add data in. So when there's a team of people working on a piece of research, actually a framework can be a really nice way of allowing everyone to contribute to the analysis and keep everyone kind of on the same page as to how it's working. Framework analysis can also make it easier to see contradictions or differences in your data. So for example, if you imagine in your framework, in your table, that your columns are themes, then by browsing down a column, you can see how particular kinds of participants talk differently about that theme. So that's a really nice way of getting a quick view of differences between participants between what's in different rows. And a final real bonus of this approach is that the framework, the table itself, is useful to show people and have a discussion about the analysis. So presenting your findings can be very straightforward if you have the framework in front of you, and it gives you something to focus discussion around. Negatives of framework analysis. I think because of the extra structure that it's imposing compared to thematic analysis, it can sometimes seem tempting to give quantitative measures. So saying, X many people tick the box for this theme. And you can almost imagine the framework as more of a ticks and crosses rather than summarized descriptions in each cell. Because you can do that, that's not why you would choose to use framework analysis. I think fundamentally, like thematic analysis, it is a qualitative and interpretive approach. And finally, a second negative of framework analysis, and I guess reiterating the point we made about thematic analysis, is that neither of these approaches are about analysing how language is used in granular detail. I've been talking a little bit abstractly about these analysis approaches, so it's useful to see what they look like on paper, or rather on the screen. This is an example of what thematic analysis might look like. So what we've got here is a screenshot from some software that helps you do qualitative analysis. In the middle, we've got a section of a transcript, and you can see that certain sentences have been highlighted. So it's being divided into chunks, and those chunks have been given labels, so it's coded. And on the left-hand panel, you've got a list of all those different codes that we've produced for those chunks. And then on the right-hand side, you've got a more visual representation of which codes correspond to which parts of the highlighted text. So for example, you could see that the first two sentences of this are coded to this particular code. So that's what you're producing with thematic analysis. You've got these marked up transcripts, you've got a list of codes that describes what's been marked up in the transcript, and then you've got a set of themes which organize those codes. Here's an example of what framework analysis looks like. It doesn't matter so much if you can't read it, but what's key is obviously that it's formatted as a table. And what you've got here are, in this case, the columns refer to different groups of participants. So there's columns for adults, younger adults, older adults, and then each row, in this case, is a theme in the data. And there's a little bit of a hierarchy here as well. So you've got a theme in bold, and then under that a certain number of sub-themes. Each cell is a summary of your data corresponding to that group and that theme. So for example, what did older adults say on this particular topic? And as you go through the analysis, these cells, the content of those cells grows and grows as you add in new data. It may be a pure summary and paraphrasing of what's in the data. It could also perfectly possible to include kind of exemplar quotes from the data that then becomes very easy to pick out when you're presenting findings. So that is what a framework looks like. We can spell out the process for doing thematic analysis in a bit more detail, and the steps I'm going to go through are the steps that are described in this paper by Brown and Clark using thematic analysis in psychology. This is a really highly cited paper, so this is the go-to reference in many method sections in other qualitative papers that report doing thematic analysis. So according to Brown and Clark, analysis starts with simply familiarising yourself with your data. And that might sound trivial, but in fact it's really useful to spend time reading through your data and getting your head around it. And I think even if you're pushed for time, it's a valuable thing to do before jumping in to coding your data, because it orientates you to the data without also at the same time having to think about how you're going to code it. The next stage is coding, and what that means, as we sort of hinted at before, what that means is reading through the transcripts and taking them line by line and deciding how to break them up into chunks that are about a particular thing. And then once you've got those chunks, labeling them, giving them a code that describes it, and working through your data, organizing those chunks into particular codes. In that initial stage, you don't necessarily have to give too much thought about how many codes you're creating. Rather, it's more about just chunking it out and describing those chunks. Once you've got your data coded, then you can start looking at those codes and how they relate to other codes, and working them up into themes and bringing them together and categorizing. So in the first instance, that might just be a kind of a consistency check, where you look at all of the chunks under a particular code and go, are these really all about the same thing? And then at the next stage, asking whether there are patterns between codes that allow codes to be grouped together, whether there are similar sets of ideas that multiple codes capture. So you can think of themes as kind of organizing the codes you've got, and what relationships are there between the codes that you think are important and salient, and how can that be simplified into a smaller number of themes. Once you've got a set of themes that organize your codes, then the next task is to review those themes, and what that really means is looking again at the codes that make up the theme, checking that yes, they actually does fit under there, or no, actually it's not a very good fit here, and it's actually part of a different theme. Looking at the data itself and saying, is that really representative of the theme that you're saying that it's part of? Because what you want to avoid in this process of coding and then generating themes is kind of abstracting too far from the data and falling into the trap that we mentioned previously of over-interpreting things. So this reviewing process, where you go back to the data, check it makes sense in light of the code you've come up with, check it makes sense in light of the themes you've generated from that, is really useful for avoiding that particular pitfall of over-interpretation. And the final step in Brown and Clark's process for thematic analysis is interpreting and reporting the data. And in some ways that's the hardest step, because that's actually about working out what the story is in the data, and going beyond just describing the data, but working out what story you want to tell, what the themes are evidence for and what conclusions you want to draw. And that's the basic process. We can also spell out in more detail the process for conducting framework analysis. So what I'm going to go through now are a similar set of steps taken from this paper on the right about how to conduct framework analysis. And you'll see that the first 3 steps are really exactly as you'd be doing as if you were doing a thematic analysis. So having the data transcribed, you're getting familiar with the data and then doing some initial coding. Framework analysis starts to differ from thematic analysis in those steps within the box, so steps 4, 5, and 6. And that's because rather than moving from codes to themes, you're moving from your codes to a framework, which as I mentioned previously, involves summarizing your data in that table format. Another thing you're doing differently with framework analysis is you're not necessarily generating the framework from the totality of your data like you would do with thematic analysis. So instead, you're using a subset of your data to create the framework and then applying that to the rest of your data. So that's why framework analysis can be quicker than thematic analysis, or allow you to analyze more data in a similar amount of time, because you're using a subset to generate the framework and then just churning through and applying that framework to the rest of your data. Another point worth making is when we've been talking about thematic analysis, we've been thinking in terms of having a transcript in front of you and marking up the data to code it. With framework analysis, your data doesn't all need to be in that transcribed format. Instead, you might be listening to audio recordings and directly summarizing them into cells in the framework, which again is a reason why framework analysis can be particularly useful for rapid research, where you might not want to invest the time or cost of having recordings transcribed. So that's the process for framework analysis and some of the ways that it differs from the process for thematic analysis. I mentioned earlier that there were different ways of moving from codes to themes. There was an inductive approach or a deductive approach. So it's worth saying a little bit more about that now. An inductive approach works from the ground up, and you're really letting your interpretation of the data determine what the framework or themes should be. And in contrast to that, you could take a deductive approach, which is more top-down. And what that means is that you've got some kind of idea in advance about what your themes or your framework's going to be. And that might be more or less fixed or flexible. But what you're doing is you're kind of going hunting in the data for those themes that are known in advance. I've used both approaches. Neither one is right or wrong, and neither one is more or less rigorous than the other. I think actually which one is more appropriate largely depends on things like what's known about a research topic and what your research aims are. So I guess, as you can imagine, inductive approaches can be more useful if you're doing something very exploratory, where you're trying to generate a theory about how something works, whereas deductive approaches can be more useful if you have a clearer idea about what to expect in the data and what you want to get from it, and that might also be reflected in when you're doing a data collection, the kinds of questions that you ask. That actually that can largely structure the follow through and structure the analysis. So that's the difference between inductive and deductive approaches. I'll finish now with some general hints and tips about qualitative research. The first of those is to remain focused, especially when you're coding the data. I think it can be easy to get distracted by data, by the fact that an interview is really interesting. Each person you speak to is unique and individual, and those things can sometimes get in the way of coding for what you want to get out of the data. So it's important to keep focused and not get too interested. Secondly, it's important to be aware of your own biases. Analysis is an interpretive process, so some awareness of what you're bringing to that process and the impact that it has is important. It's important to reflect on that. Related to that, it's also important to bring a flexible approach to the analysis, and the more you can do to kind of iterate through the analysis process, so revisiting your data and codes and themes and refining your analysis, all of that checking and rechecking makes the analysis stronger. I guess building on that, specifically going through your data and looking for negative examples, so that's examples that maybe contradict a particular code or theme. That can be a really good antidote to overgeneralization, and understanding where people said the opposite of what you're claiming and why. And then finally, it can be really helpful to take your findings and check them back with the people you interviewed. That can be a really nice extra validation of whether the things you're claiming on the basis of your data really stand up. Thank you very much. The next thing to have a go at is a little task. So this is a coding task. It gives you the chance to have a go at coding yourself, to get a feel for what it's like to go through a transcript and decide what's important and mark it up and code it. The first thing you'll need for this task is a transcript of an interview with June. So June's a participant who's been interviewed, and it's her experiences that we're looking at. So there's a link to that, so you can download that transcript that accompanies this video. So when you're doing the task, the scenario to put yourself in is to imagine that you want to understand people's perceptions about what causes overweight and obesity, and that's what this interview with June is geared towards exploring. So someone doing the analysis of this transcript, the task is to work through it line by line and code June's understanding of the causes of overweight and obesity. To recap a little bit about what we mean by coding. So code is a label that tells you what particular sections of the transcript are about, and you're dividing the transcript into chunks of text that you think are about particular things. To link back to what I said earlier about inductive and deductive approaches to analysis, so I'm not giving you any predefined codes for you to look for examples of in the transcript. That would be a deductive approach. Instead, in this task, the idea is that you read the transcript and interpret it yourself, and that you come up with what you think are the appropriate codes to describe what's going on in the interview. So that means that we're approaching this task inductively. So have a go at that, see how you get on. To quickly give you an example of what the end product of this task should look like, here's a picture of a different transcript, so this isn't June's transcript. But what you can see is, so you've got the transcript itself, you've got chunks of text highlighted, and each of those chunks has a label next to it, a code next to it. You can see in the first few sentences have been coded and labelled as being about a belief that any movement causes excess pain. You can then see two further chunks of text that have been highlighted, and they've been coded about perceptions of exercise, and then there's a third code in there as well, finally, about building activity levels gradually. So those labels are your codes. Those codes refer to one or more chunks of text in the transcript. And by the end of this task, that's the sort of thing you're aiming for.